to allow others to maybe to be able to watch it at some other point. Studying on the night of Shavuot that is an ancient tradition to try to relive the experience of receiving Torah at Mount Sinai. And just as the Israelites received it, and we'll read about it from the Torah portion tomorrow, so too we try to relive that awesome spiritual experience through study. So we have a token access to that by this one study session. The conservative movement, the Rabbinical Assembly, and a global conservative movement is offering an all-night tikkun, and I sent out information about that. That's what the study session is called, at Tikkun Leil Shavuot. So you, those who, if you're up with nothing to do at 2 o'clock in the morning, then you can go on the internet and find a study session from the conservative movement at that point too. So they'll have all night through noon tomorrow with the conservative movement. So what I want to do this evening is, because I'm doing the Daf Yomi, the traditional page a day of Talmud study, there's lots of fascinating stuff that we find there, some relevant to today, most not relevant to today, and sometimes bizarre stories, like the one I want to share with you. So sharing my screen, and here we go. Okay, so I titled this session, Racing to Fulfill a Commandment, What a Story from the Talmud Can Teach Us About Spirituality. Okay, so a little bit of background on this. The story is from the tractate Yoma. Yoma is Aramaic for the Hebrew Hayom, which means the day. And the day that tractate talks about is Yom Kippur. So the tractate for the first 30 odd pages that we're up to so far in the Daf Yomi calendar is dealing with the service of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, in the temple in Jerusalem, and details for us the what the Torah teaches from Leviticus chapter 16 about what the high priest had to do on Yom Kippur itself, and changing into the variety of garments and the sacrifices offered there. And because they're talking about the day of Yom Kippur, they talk about other things that the Kohanim have to do in the temple. So this story from here is related to what we learn in the book of Leviticus in chapter 6. The beginning of the portion, Tzav, details for us this. The burnt offering shall remain where it is burned upon the altar all night until morning, while the fire on the altar is kept going on it. Okay, so you have an animal that was slaughtered, sacrificed on the altar. It stays on the altar all night, and the fire has to be kept burning on the altar all night. Okay, the priest, though, so now what do you do with it before the next day's service? The priest shall dress in linen raiment with linen breeches next to his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar and place them beside the altar. Okay, so a priest has to come dressed up specially in linen garments and take the ashes of the sacrifice that had burned all night. So before morning, at some time before morning, the priest comes dressed in this special way to clean out the altar of the ashes and place the ashes beside the altar. Okay? So that's what the Torah describes for us. The Torah describes in the beginning of the book of Leviticus for several chapters, the first 8 or 9 chapters, a whole variety of sacrifices that are to be offered by the Kohanim. Okay, so this story, which I'm about to share with you, is based on this element. So this isn't an offering of a sacrifice. This is cleaning up, right? So it's not the doing the dishes. It's not the preparing the meal. It's the doing the dishes afterward. Okay, and who likes doing the dishes? Some people like doing the dishes, but it's a pain in the neck. It's a chore, right? It should be seen as a chore. And that's what we could understand from the Torah itself. And the Torah makes it clear, no, this isn't a chore that you want to try to not have to do or try to get out of. This is just as important as offering the sacrifice. The Kohen who cleans the ashes has to be dressed in a special way, and it's just as important a ritual as the offering of the sacrifice itself. So in other words, the sacrifice is holy all the way through, from designating the animal to be sacrificed, to the actual ritual of the slaughter of the sacrifice, to the offering of the sacrifice on the altar, to even after it gets burned up, the ashes from it are still holy. Okay, so that's what we learn from Leviticus. Now, the Talmud tells us this story. Initially, so the way that Talmud works very quickly is that the Talmud is a combination of Mishnah and Gemara. Mishnah is the 6-volume law code edited by the rabbis 1800 years ago. It's oral tradition that was written down 1800 years ago, but oral tradition that covered 300 years of time, 100 BCE to 200 CE, organized in 6 volumes by and edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The Gemara continues the oral tradition of study of these laws, and the Gemara is 20 volumes on half of the material of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is 6 volumes, the Gemara is 20 volumes. The 20 volumes of the Gemara is on half the material that the Mishnah covers. And that's for the next 300 years, edited in the year 500 in Babylonia. Or there's a Jerusalem edition, an Israel edition of the Talmud, less popular, harder to study. That was edited 200 years later. So the Jerusalem Talmud, the year edited around the year 400. The Babylonian Talmud edited around the year 500. Okay, so that's just the background for what the Talmud is. So this Mishnah is telling us this law. Initially, the practice among the priests was that whoever wishes to remove the ashes from the altar removes them, right? Someone volunteers. They would wait for someone to volunteer to remove the ashes. The removing the ashes here is the same word for this taking up from Leviticus. Okay, so removing the ashes, right, is the word for it here. And so that's the way it was initially. Whoever volunteered, they wouldn't have to worry. Somebody would volunteer. And when there are many priests who wish to perform that task, right? You got more than one person volunteering to do it. What are you going to do? How do you choose one over another? So they came up with this bizarre idea. When there are many priests who wish to perform that task, the privilege to do so is determined by a race. The priests run and ascend on the ramp leading to the top of the altar. Any priest who precedes another and reaches within 4 cubits, that's 6 feet. Whoever gets to 6 feet from the altar first is privileged to remove the ashes. So I just want to stop there and just say, if you were trying to figure out how to choose a priest, one over another, would it ever enter your mind, okay, race to the altar and see who gets there first? It sounds like a bizarre idea, something for children to do, maybe. Okay, you guys run it out and see who gets there first. Sounds like a fun game to do on the playground with 3rd graders. These are adult men, and they're running up the altar, running up this ramp to get to the altar to try to be the first one to be able to offer the sacrifice. So I can't make heads or tails of this. By the way, unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment about this or anything that we're talking about. I just think that this is bizarre. That so I think the rabbis thought it was bizarre as well. So here's as it goes on. Any priest, if both of them were equal, right? So they have a race, and let's say the two of them, it's like they didn't have such a thing as a photo finish. So they right, you can't go to replay to see whose finger was outstretched or go to slow motion to figure out who got there first. It's just by the eyes, and it looks like they both got there at the same time. If both of them were equal and neither preceded the other, the appointed priest says to all the priests, extend your fingers, and a lottery was performed, as will be explained. Right? So by extending their fingers, the head priest that day would determine who's going to, it's like playing rock, paper, scissors. So whether you put one finger out or two fingers out, that's what how this was done. So the head priest would say, okay, extend your fingers, and then they extend their fingers. One of them puts one puts two, and the head priest determines, well, the lottery was two, so the guy who put out two wins. Okay, that's apparently how this lottery was done. One finger or two fingers. And what fingers do they extend for the lottery? Okay, if you're supposed to extend one finger or two, this is kind of like a parenthetical note. Which one finger, which two fingers are you going to put out? Okay, is it this finger? Is it the pinky finger? Is it the middle finger? Is it the ring finger, index finger? Is it the thumb? They may extend one or two fingers, and the priests do not extend the thumb in the temple. You're not supposed to extend the thumb in the temple. And now, that's all it says in the Talmud. Ein motzi'in agudal bamikdash. They don't extend the thumb in the temple. The unbolded, from the English translation of the Talmud that's available online from a website called Sefaria. It's translated by Rabbi Steinsaltz and his crew in Jerusalem. The unbolded is usually taken from the preeminent commentator to the Talmud from Rashi. Okay, so the reason that the lottery was conducted by the appointee, choosing a number and counting the extended fingers of the priests standing in a circle. As the count progressed, a priest could calculate and manipulate the result in his favor by surreptitiously extending his thumb and an additional finger. Since there is separation between the thumb and the forefinger, it could appear as though they belong to two different priests, skewing the results of the lottery. So this is what I think, instead of the one or two and the priest saying, I'm choosing two, let's say there are 5 priests up there. The head priest saying, and when I get to number 10, whoever's finger I land on, that's going to be the priest that will be designated to clean the ashes. So they're standing in a circle. All 10 of them, let's say, are standing around the designated priest. They either put out 1 or 2 fingers like this. They don't put out the thumb, because if you put out the thumb and a finger, they're so far apart, the commentary is saying, it could look like they're 2 different people here. If the priest is counting fingers and not looking necessarily at the hand to which the finger is attached, it could be confusing. So don't use the thumb, use the first or the second finger, and don't play with so that's how the lottery was done. Put out the fingers there, and that's the better way to do it, rather than running up the ramp. Okay, so now, initially that was the procedure. However, an incident occurred where both of them were equal as they were running and ascending on the ramp. Okay, so you had the race. The race was the way to do it. And one of them shoved another, and he fell, and his leg was broken. So let's say Dennis and I'm just looking at my screen. Dennis and I are the two priests who want to clean up these ashes. And we both really want to do it. So we race up there. I decide I really want to do this. So I shove Dennis off the ramp because I want to get there. My desire is to clean up these ashes. I want to have the privilege of dressing in the special garments, these linen garments, and having the honor of taking these holy ashes away from the altar. And I will do anything to do that, even shoving Dennis aside so that he falls over the ramp, shoved another, and he fell, and his leg was broken, and Dennis breaks his leg. So, and once the court saw that people were coming to potential danger, they instituted that priests would remove ashes from the altar only by means of a lottery. There were 4 lotteries there in the temple on a daily basis to determine the priest's privilege to perform the various services, and this determining which priest would remove the ashes was the first lottery. Okay, so what we also need to understand, that's a backstory behind this, is that there was always a conflict between the Kohanim and the rabbis as to who was the authority to determine how things were done in the temple. Before the rabbis came along, the temple existed before the rabbis came along. What we know of Jewish history, that the second temple was built, well, you had the first temple there were no rabbis there in the first temple. Why couldn't they share the duties between themselves? Right. There were apparently, for this Mishnah, as the tractate points out later, which we're not dealing with tonight, is that there were lotteries for the different for some different things that were to be done for the daily sacrifices. Instead of the head priest designated as the head priest that day, instead of him being able to determine who does it, there could be a sense of favoritism there, maybe, and some priests could be ignored. You have a lottery, so to make it as fair as possible for as many of the priests to be involved as possible. Okay, so that's why we think that the lottery was done. Okay. When the first temple was standing, that King Solomon built that temple, let's say, to round it out, around the year 1000 BCE. And it stood for about 400 or close to 500 years, 450 years, something like that. So there were no rabbis at the time. The Kohanim were determining what happened there. Then the Babylonians come, destroy the temple, exile the Jews to Babylonia. 70 years later, Persians defeat the Babylonians. Jews are allowed back to Israel. And a few years after that, they rebuild the temple there, the second temple. The second temple is built around, just to round it out, 500 BCE, and it stands until 70 CE. So the second temple stands for about 570 years. Until the last 70 or 80 years, the Kohanim are completely in charge. For the last 70 or 80, the rabbis become an institution within the Jewish community, and they are trying to determine and get the authority over the entire Jewish community, even over the Kohanim who are working in the temple. And so there's a power play between the rabbis and the Kohanim. The Kohanim have one way to do things. The rabbis are trying to teach them their way, how they think it should be done based on the rabbi's interpretation of the Torah. So there's back and forth. So it's unclear from this story how it was originally done or how the rabbis were make it happen. So it's possible that for the tradition for the Kohanim is to have this race. and that because the rabbis win out, it's more likely that this story is a critique, and we'll see definitely that this story is a critique of the Kohanim by what comes next. What we have is a critique of the Kohanim. The rabbis are saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you doing races in the temple for? That's demeaning, it's childish, it allows for people's aggression to play out. You have a sense of, like if I gave this example, I'm running up the ramp with Dennis and I really want to do this, I'm going to shove him to the side and he'll break his leg as a result, if not worse. That we don't want that happening in the temple, the rabbis are saying. The temple is supposed to be this holy, sacred place. And running up the ramp like this to try to be first in order to do the job is not what the spirituality of the temple service is supposed to be. It takes away from the spirituality. You're bringing human emotion into the ritual where there shouldn't be human emotion. It should all be about wanting to serve God. And you can't serve God by shoving somebody aside on a ramp. So the rabbis instituted this lottery system in order to be sure that nobody would get hurt in the temple. Okay, so that's how the rabbis are teaching this. And I just want to point out this power play between the Kohanim and the rabbis. We see this power play many other places in the Talmud. We even see it in the prayer book. And I'll just take a tangent here to point this out. In the prayer book, the second prayer in the Amidah that we recite every day, 3 times a day. The second prayer is, like if I sing it the way we sing it on Shabbat, Mechakel Chayim Bechesed, Mechaye Meitim Berachamim Rabim. We're all familiar with that tune, right? That's part of the second prayer of the Amidah. Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, who sustains life with compassion, Mechaye Meitim Berachamim Rabim, who brings the dead back to life with great mercy. Okay, so the second prayer of the Amidah talks about God's power. And the greatest power of all is that God can bring the dead back to life. That's the greatest power of all. So to prove that this is a power play, this prayer itself is a power play between the Kohanim and the rabbis. I remember from rabbinical school, it's one of the lessons that really has stuck with me from rabbinical school, from freshman year of rabbinical school. So this is 1984. A visiting professor from Hebrew University taught this class on liturgy in Hebrew, which was really a great honor. This Dr. Avigdor Shinan, who was the preeminent scholar on Jewish prayer. His theory was, and most people accept this theory today, is that this prayer was put into the Amidah to show that the rabbis are in charge. The Kohanim were literal readers of the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible itself about the dead coming back to life. There's nothing in there that idea that is central to Judaism. We have it in the Amidah. We just sang it at the end of Yigdal. Meitim Yechayel Berov Chasto. The dead, God will bring the dead back to life with great compassion. That's the last line of Yigdal. 13 articles of faith that are put to music, that are put to poetry, that says what it means to be a traditional normative Jew. It includes a belief that the dead will come back to life. That's what we believe in with the Messiah, the time of the Messiah. That's why we're buried in a shroud, in a wooden casket, so that we will be ready to be brought back to life in the time of the Messiah, brought back to the land of Israel. That is a rabbinic idea created by the rabbis to provide a sense of comfort to the people of Israel who are suffering under the Romans. Why do good people suffer? The rabbis are saying, don't worry, we'll see our reward in the world to come, and the time of the Messiah. The Kohanim are saying, there's nothing in the Bible about this. How dare you, rabbis, create something out of whole cloth? This is nothing that we should believe in. The rabbis are saying, well, okay, we're saying we have to pray 3 times a day. This is what we're going to include in our prayer. Everybody who says the prayer has to say, anybody who davens 3 times a day has to include this in the prayer. You can't skip this. It has to be said. So this is one of the prayers that's said 3 times a day, 365 days a year. That's how intense the conflict and the struggle for authority was in the Jewish community. So the rabbis are criticizing the Kohanim for their race up the altar ramp to try to be first to the altar, when the rabbis themselves are incorporating this conflict into what it means to be a Jew. So they criticize the Kohanim for how they're behaving in the temple, but the rabbis themselves should be criticized for how they set the prayer book and instituted authority over the entire Jewish community by forcing people to believe what they hadn't believed before. Now, at the same token, they also kept out the followers of Jesus from the synagogue as well. So you had a fundamentalist wing, a more conservative with a small c wing that were the followers of the Kohanim, who said the Bible should be the key. And then you have the followers of Jesus, who are more progressive in terms of, and evolutionary in terms of some ideas of what Judaism should be about, and more lax when it comes to some elements of Jewish law. The rabbis had to navigate between those 2 extremes and others in the Jewish community to set the stage for what it means to be Jewish according to the rabbis. Okay, so these are the conflicts that are going on. So here, because the rabbis win the day, we hear the rabbi version of the story in which they're criticizing the Kohanim for this race and forcing the Kohanim to institute this lottery instead. That's a more dignified approach to choose which Kohen is going to offer this, which Kohen is going to clean up the ashes from the altar. Okay, so now the Gemara just explains this a little bit more about how they instituted the lottery. The Gemara questions the original practice of holding a race to determine which priest would remove the ashes. And what's the reason that the sages did not initially institute a lottery for the removal of the ashes, as they did for the other parts of the service? The Gemara answers, initially they thought since it's a service performed at night, it wouldn't be important to the priests, right? Who's going to get up in the middle of the night or before dawn to clean up the ashes? And not many of them would come to perform it. So a lottery would be unnecessary, right? Because maybe one person would do it. Then when they saw that many priests did indeed come, that they were coming to danger by racing up the altar's ramp, they instituted a lottery. So the rabbis were surprised how spiritually into their task the Kohanim were. And they were even willing to get up before dawn in order to do this sacred task. Rabbis were surprised about that. That's interesting that the rabbis were willing to admit their surprise over how spiritually into the task the Kohanim were. But they wanted to be sure that they're safe, like no running next to the pool, no running up the ramp to get to the altar. So institute a lottery instead. Now, we're going to get to now the heart of the story, the bizarre part of the story. The Talmud, for the next page, the Talmud goes off on a lot of tangents, and then we get back to this race up the ramp. It was taught in the Mishnah. So there's the story from the time that preceded the rabbis of the Talmud to the Mishnah itself. So from the time that the temple was still standing, this story was still there, and it carried down throughout the ages. An incident occurred where both of the priests were equal as they were running and climbing the ramp, running up the ramp, and one of them shoved the other, and he fell, and his leg was broken. Right. So that's what we learned above. The sages taught in the Tosefta. There's another version of this story. The Tosefta is another collection of teachings of the rabbis that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but made it into this other book called the Tosefta. Okay? An incident occurred, so it wasn't just a broken leg. An incident occurred where there were two priests who were equal as they were running and ascending the ramp. One of them reached the 4 cubits before his colleague, who then, out of anger, took a knife and stabbed him in the heart. So now this could either be, let's say it's me, Dennis and me running up the ramp. It's unclear from the Aramaic or the Hebrew here of the story. Let's say I won the race. I think it is clear. So let's say I won the race. Dennis, in anger for losing the race, pulls out the knife. Every Kohen has a knife on him, ready to do work with an animal, slaughtering, flaying, whatever needed to be done. Dennis, angry that he lost the race to me, pulls out his knife and stabs me in the heart. Okay, so so the original story was that I shoved Dennis and he broke his leg. This version of the story is that Dennis is angry that he loses the race and he stabs me in the heart. Okay, so now if that was the end of the story, it's not. Let's see what happens. Rabbi Tzadok then stood up on the steps of the entrance hall of the sanctuary and said, "Hear this, my brothers of the house of Israel. The verse states, if one be found slain in the land, and it not be known who had smitten him, then your elders and your judges shall come forth, and they shall measure, and it shall be that the city which is nearest to the slain man shall take a heifer." Okay, let me stop there before we go on. What is this story? What is this reference in the book of Deuteronomy? Okay, we have to understand this reference and why Rabbi Tzadok is taking this reference out of context. Where we learn at the end of the portion Shoftim that if a man is found dead between two towns, right? A Jewish man found dead, somebody has to claim responsibility for that dead man. So the elders of the two nearest towns are brought together and they measure the distance from their towns to the dead body. Whichever town is closer to the dead body, okay? So let's say Olney and Brookville are two Jewish towns. And a Jewish dead body is found between Olney and Brookville. Now there's not much between Olney and Brookville. So let me say between Sandy Spring and Brookville. Okay, Olney is in between. Okay, just play with me with the geography, okay? So Sandy Spring and Brookville are two Jewish towns, and a Jewish man is found dead in Olney between Sandy Spring and Brookville. They measure, the elders of Sandy Spring and the elders of Brookville will come and measure from the gate, the city gate of Sandy Spring and the city gate of Brookville. Whichever one is closer to the dead body, then that town takes responsibility for the dead body, okay? And they'll have to claim the dead body and take care of the dead body as if he was their own, okay? So this is the story for an unclaimed, unknown dead body. Now, what does this have to do with what happened in the temple? There's no unclaimed body there. These are the Kohanim. One Kohen stabs another Kohen in the heart. But this Rabbi Tzadok is taking these verses out of context to teach about responsibility for the dead. The elders of that city took that heifer, and so they're supposed to do a special sacrifice to make amends, to atone for the fact that this person ended up dead instead of the people being responsible for that person and keeping him alive. The elders of that city that took that heifer broke its neck in a ritual of atonement. So, okay, so that's the context. So now Rabbi Tzadok says, but what of us in our situation? Upon whom is the obligation to bring the heifer whose neck is broken? Well, there wouldn't be any obligation because Rabbi Tzadok is bringing this story wrongly. This situation doesn't apply in this. In other words, Dennis stabbed me. Dennis is responsible for my murder. Should be brought to the Sanhedrin. He would be brought, there are plenty of witnesses there, and he should be executed by the Sanhedrin. That's what should happen. Not that, but Rabbi Tzadok is suggesting, no, the Kohanim should all be responsible for each other to have made sure that Dennis wouldn't have reached this point of anger to want to stab me in the heart. That's what Rabbi Tzadok is saying. Upon whom is the obligation to bring the heifer whose neck is broken? Does the obligation fall on the city of Jerusalem so that sages must bring the calf? Or does the obligation fall upon the temple courtyard so that the priests must bring it? At that point, the entire assembly of people burst into tears. Who's responsible for Dennis having been so angry to stab me in the heart? Is it the Kohanim who are responsible or the rabbis who are responsible? And Rabbi Tzadok, who is a Kohen, he is a member of both communities, the rabbinic community and the Kohen community. The rabbis who instituted the lottery to keep things calm, or the Kohanim who wanted to keep the race going. So who's responsible for this getting out of hand? The rabbis for not having been so insistent on the lottery, or the Kohanim who are insistent on the race happening? The Kohanim who wanted the tradition that always was a race, so we're always going to do a race, or the rabbis who said, no, let's calm things down and institute a lottery? Were the rabbis upset with themselves for not being able to convince the Kohanim to change their ways? Or the Kohanim responsible because their ways led to Dennis stabbing me in the heart? And the people burst into tears. The Kohanim, what does that mean? Were they upset about that their ways led to Dennis stabbing me in the heart? Or are they upset because they hadn't listened to the rabbis sooner? The father this is the final little twist of the knife, literally and figuratively, for the rabbis to get in one little last thing to say how ridiculous these Kohanim are and how wrong they are in their spirituality. What is this race doing? The father of the boy, okay? So that's me. I am the one who stabbed in their heart. So Dennis stabbed me. My father comes along. The father of the boy, that is the young priest who was stabbed, came and found that he was still convulsing. Okay, so I'm not dead yet. I'm still alive. Dennis stabbed me in the heart. I'm going to die. There's nothing nobody can do to save me. But I'm still alive. My father comes along, sees that I'm still alive. My father says, may my son's death be atonement for you. Okay, so like my son's going to be the heifer, and he is the atonement for this, but my son is still convulsing, has not yet died, and as such, the knife, which is in his body, the knife that Dennis used to stab me, which was supposed to be meant to slaughter an animal or to cut up the animal, right? Meant for holy purposes. My son is still convulsing, not yet died, and as such, the knife, which is in his body and has not become ritually impure through contact with a corpse. If you remove it promptly, it will still be pure for future use. My father, a Kohen, I'm a Kohen, Dennis is a Kohen. Dennis stabs me in the heart. My father says, I'm going to be atonement for Rabbi Tzadok in his sermon to get people, rile them up and get them upset about what just happened. My son is the atonement. And also, don't worry, the knife that is in him is still pure. And it can still be used because he's still alive. Only if a knife comes into contact with the dead will the knife become impure. because I'm still alive. Pull it out right now, just wash it off, and it's ready to use. What the heck? What the heck? Bizarre, right? So what this means, because again, this is a rabbi writing a story about the Kohanim. So the rabbis are highlighting in this story how inane and how spiritually corrupt the Kohanim are. They care about their ways. The race is important. The race has always been done. We're always going to do the race. So it got out of control today. We're still going to do a race. So somebody breaks a leg. We're still going to do a race. So Dennis the Kohen stabs Jonah the Kohen in the heart. Still going to do the race. And don't worry, Jonah's still alive, so that knife can still be used. So what are the rabbis trying to say? The Kohanim only care about their very specific rituals and ritual purity and impurity. They lose the forest for the trees. In other words, they only care about the little rituals without understanding the bigger picture. The bigger picture is about how all these rituals are supposed to inspire a sense of holiness and spirituality. It's not doing the ritual for the ritual's sake. It's doing the ritual for the bigger purpose of getting closer to God. And how the rabbis are trying to teach the Kohanim this. The Kohanim are resistant to the rabbis' teachings. The Kohanim are resistant to these new progressive ideas that the rabbis are coming along and trying to teach. And so the Kohanim and the rabbis, in commenting on how resistant the Kohanim are, add this bizarre, unfeeling, ridiculous thing that the father of the stabbed Kohen says. Don't worry, the knife is still pure. It still can be used. In other words, don't give a damn about my son. Doesn't matter that this happened. This just is the way, this is our way, the way we do things. The knife can still be used for ritual purposes. The Tosefta comments, this incident comes to teach you that the ritual purity of utensils was of more concern to them than the shedding of blood, right? That's what it seems to teach. Even the boy's father voiced more concern over the purity of the knife than over the death of his child. And this is how the rabbis end this story. And similarly, it says, furthermore, Menashe spilled innocent blood very much till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. From the book of 2 Kings, chapter 21, which shows that in his day as well, people paid little attention to bloodshed, but even more so. King Menashe was the longest ruling king in all the history of the kings of Israel. He ruled for 50 years. And his kingship was the worst of all the kings of Israel because he was the most idolatrous of all the kings of Israel. So the spilling of blood that happened for him, that was child sacrifice. So it wasn't just the spilling of blood, it was the spilling of blood for child sacrifice. So that was idolatry. And by the rabbis ending the story by using a proof text, which is about idolatry, is saying that the ways of the Kohen are idolatrous. Running up the ramp and doing a race that could lead to shoving somebody aside and breaking their leg, that could lead to somebody stabbing somebody else in the heart, that's idolatry. That is not spirituality. And that's what the rabbis are saying about this story. So they are trying to institute and rein in the Kohanim so that their practices, their traditions won't lead to idolatry, not the worship of an idol, but the worship of the worship service itself. Any service that is all about the service itself and not about God is idolatry. So if if even cleaning the ashes, which is the most menial, one of the most menial of the tasks, there was also a lottery as to who was going to set out the logs on the altar that would be the kindling. These menial tasks are supposed to be sacred, holy, spiritual tasks, and they should be done in a spiritual, holy way. If they're done in a way that leads to injury, murder, or idolatry, that the task itself becomes the important aspect, as opposed to any of this supposed to be leading to getting closer to God, that's idolatry. That's wrong. So, any thoughts, questions, or comments about this story? What do you think? Any ideas about it? So this is like the third or fourth time that I came across this story. Every time I read the story, I'm just blown away. First of all, the creativity. Did this happen in the temple? We have no idea. Okay. The rabbis admit that the story was there before the rabbis of the Talmud. It was from the time of the Mishnah. Did the story exist or not? We don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there's a critique. This is one of many critiques found in the Talmud of the Kohanim and the ways of the Kohanim. And that, so it's a critique of the Kohen and the whole Kohen system, which was corrupt and idolatrous. It's also a comment on how we are supposed to be spiritual ourselves. That, in other words, whatever ritual we're involved in, whether it's buying Shabbos candles, lighting the Shabbos candles, whether it is cooking blintzes for Shavuot. If you only, and I'm looking at Jules' background there, right? Those delicious looking blintzes there. If the cooking of the blintzes is about how delicious your blintzes are, and I'm making my blintzes, and I'm just making this for the story's sake, I want to be sure that my blintzes are going to be tastier than Charlotte's blintzes, or Sylvia's blintzes, or Barbara's blintzes, then that defeats the whole purpose of having blintzes for Shavuot. The purpose of having blintzes on Shavuot is to understand the sweetness of Torah. Dairy food, according to the rabbis, is sweet. We eat sweet food on Shavuot to bring home the image of the sweetness of Torah, so that when we eat those delicious blintzes that are behind Jules, then that's reminding us of Torah. It's not reminding us that Jonah's blintzes are tastier than Charlotte's or Sylvia's or Rita's or Barbara's blintzes. That's not the point. The point is to eat the blintzes to remind you of Torah. That's the idea that the rabbis are trying to teach us in this story itself. Because otherwise, if it's all about who has the tastiest blintzes, it could lead me, if we have a blintz competition, like on the Food Network, who's going to have the better blintzes, I might mess up, like it's Charlotte and me and Rita and Barbara and Sylvia all vying for the tastiest blintzes. If we want the tastiest blintzes, I could poison everybody else's blintzes, and I could substitute, I don't know, salted cottage cheese instead of the sweetest ricotta or farmer's cheese. And then the judges are going to taste, ugh, who likes Charlotte's blintzes? They're disgusting. Jonah's blintzes are the best, right? So that's all this, just playing this out in this way. This is not the idea of blintzes on Shavuot. The blintzes, this as one of all the rituals, right? It's not about who has the nicest Shabbos candles, whose Shabbos candles lasts for the longest or burns the brightest. It's not whose lulav and etrog are the smells the sweetest and is the biggest and is the yellowest of all the lulavim and etrog, or whose sukkah is the finest sukkah to eat in. It's not about that. And if it is about that, then it's like this story of pushing the Kohen off the side and breaking his leg, or stabbing him in the heart. That's not what ritual is supposed to be. Ritual is supposed to be doing the best we can to allow this ritual to bring us closer to God. So that is the story I wanted to share with us for Shavuot, and I hope that everybody has a Chag Sameach. Looking forward to seeing everybody at services tomorrow evening, Tuesday, and Tuesday evening as well. And enjoy your blintzes.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Enjoy
We
your
just got Marv very hungry, so he left for the blintzes.
All right. Wish him a Chag Sameach.
Everyone.
What, Sylvia?
I'm not so sure I want to sit next to Dennis either.
Yeah. That's right. I gave him a bad,
That was a great story.
Be well, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. You've done very
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you. Have a